They thought he was just a camper they could bully, an easy target for their HOA tyranny. They illegally towed his home, mocked his rights, and rifled through his life. They had no idea they were messing with the one man who could destroy their reign. What they didn't see would be their undoing. You won't believe how this takedown unfolds. The hiss of the propane stove was a gentle counterpoint to the lapping water of Lake Serenity. Jake Miller, a man whose 42 years had etched lines of thoughtful experience rather than harshness onto his fair-skinned face, took a deep, appreciative breath. The scent of pine and damp earth was a balm to his soul, a stark contrast to the sterile meeting rooms and bureaucratic jargon that had become his recent reality. His faithful golden retriever, Buddy, lay at his feet, occasionally thumping his tail against the packed dirt, his intelligent eyes fixed on the fishing line Jake had cast out earlier. "Just a little longer, boy," Jake murmured, scratching Buddy behind the ears. Then a swim. This was exactly what he needed. His recent appointment as the regional HOA board chairman, a position designed to oversee and, where necessary, reform the various local homeowners associations within the Tri-County area, had been a whirlwind. He hadn't even had a public unveiling yet. His appointment was still an internal, inter-district matter, a strategic move to allow him to observe without the burden of immediate public scrutiny. This lakeside campsite, a legitimate spot 5 meters from the water's edge for which he possessed all the requisite suburban recreational permits, was his sanctuary, a place to decompress before diving headfirst into the hornet's nest he knew some of the local HOAs had become. He'd heard whispers, of course. Rumors of petty tyrants wielding minimal power like a monarch's scepter, of discriminatory practices veiled in anodyne language about community standards and aesthetic harmony. Lake Serenity's local HOA, he recalled from a cursory pre-appointment briefing, had a particularly colorful reputation. A sharp, metallic clang shattered the tranquility. Buddy sprang to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his attention fixed on the access road leading to their campsite. Jake's hand instinctively went to the small, waterproof pouch on his belt, where he kept his essentials. Through the trees, he saw the unmistakable bulk of a tow truck maneuvering with an unsettling precision towards his parked SUV and attached teardrop trailer. "What in the?" Jake muttered. Rising, he wasn't blocking any access, wasn't violating any posted regulations. His permits were clearly displayed on the dashboard of the SUV. Before he could take more than a few steps, 2 figures emerged from behind the tow truck, walking with an air of officious self-importance. They were women, remarkably similar in appearance, white, perhaps in their early 50s, with matching severe blonde bobs and an identical air of pursed-lipped disapproval. Jake instantly recognized the type. He'd encountered them in various forms throughout his military career and, more recently, in the periphery of civic administration. Well, what have we here?" one of them called out, her voice carrying a grating, condescending tone. "Looks like someone didn't read the community bylaws about unauthorized overnight camping." The other chimed in, a smirk playing on her lips. "And so close to the lake, too. Such a blight on the natural beauty. We have standards to maintain." Jake kept his voice even. "Excuse me, ladies, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I have a permit for this site, and I'm well within the designated recreational zone." The first woman, who Jake would soon learn was Barbara Harris, let out a short, derisive laugh. "Permits can be misinterpreted, or perhaps selectively enforced. We, as the duly elected representatives of the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association, have determined that this setup is an eyesore and detrimental to the aesthetic value of our community." Her twin, Donna, nodded in smug agreement. "That's right, detrimental. And frankly, your kind of transient presence isn't what our residents pay their dues for." The implication hung heavy in the air, as acrid as the diesel fumes now beginning to waft from the idling tow truck. Your kind. Jake felt a familiar tightening in his gut, a feeling he'd hoped to leave behind with his uniform. My kind, he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. And what kind would that be? Barbara waved a dismissive hand. Oh, people who don't respect the visual integrity of a pristine environment. People who think they can just plop themselves down wherever they please. It's about maintaining property values, something you clearly wouldn't understand. The tow truck driver, a young man with a harried expression, had emerged and was now hesitantly approaching Jake's SUV. He looked uncomfortable, glancing between Jake and the Harris twins. Ma'am, are you sure about this? The driver asked, his voice low, addressing Barbara. He says he has a permit. He says a lot of things, I'm sure. Donna snapped, her eyes narrowing at Jake. We are the HOA. Our word is final here. Hook it up. The driver looked pained, but began to unhitch a heavy chain. Buddy, sensing the escalating tension and the threat to their mobile home, began to bark in earnest, sharp, insistent barks that echoed across the normally quiet cove. Quiet that mutt, Barbara commanded. Though she took a half-step back from the agitated golden retriever, Jake put a calming hand on Buddy's head. He's just protecting his home, something I'm trying to do as well. Now, I suggest you call off your tow truck. I am legally parked. And this is harassment. Harassment, Donna scoffed, pulling a small laminated card from her pocket. We are acting within our authority as HOA officials. This is an official notice of violation. Your vehicle and trailer are being impounded due to aesthetic infractions and unsuitability within a designated scenic area. She didn't offer him the card, merely flashed it. Jake recognized the tactic, intimidation through a veneer of officialdom. An aesthetic infraction, that's remarkably vague. An unsuitability sounds suspiciously like a pretext for something else. He took a step forward. I'd like to see the specific bylaw you're referencing, and I'd like your names and official positions. Barbara and Donna exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke volumes of their shared arrogance. We don't need to justify our actions to you, Barbara said coolly. You're the one in violation. Now, are you going to step aside? Or are we going to have the sheriff escort you off the premises for obstruction? The threat of involving law enforcement was a classic escalation, designed to make most people back down. But Jake wasn't most people. He knew his rights. And more importantly, he knew the limits of HOA authority, even if these two clearly believed theirs was boundless. You're welcome to call the sheriff, Jake said, his gaze unwavering. I'm sure they'd be interested in HOA officials ordering the unlawful seizure of private property from a permitted area, especially when it's based on such flimsy and potentially discriminatory grounds. He saw a flicker of something in Donna's eyes, perhaps a sliver of uncertainty, but it was quickly masked by another layer of belligerence. Discriminatory, how dare you? We treat everyone the same. Everyone who doesn't try to turn our beautiful lakeside into a hobo jungle. The tow truck driver had now positioned the boom over Jake's trailer hitch. The chains rattled ominously. Buddy's barks intensified, drawing the attention of an elderly man who had been fishing further down the shore. The man paused his casting, watching the unfolding scene with evident curiosity, his smartphone subtly angled in their direction. This is your last chance, Barbara said, her voice rising. Move, or your vehicle will be moved for you. And trust me, the impound fees are exorbitant. Jake stood his ground. He thought of the quiet dedication of his new role, the responsibility he now carried to ensure that HOAs served their communities, not ruled them. This encounter, as infuriating as it was, felt like a microcosm of the very issues he was appointed to address. I'm not going anywhere, Jake stated calmly. And if you attach that chain to my vehicle, it will be an illegal act. It was then, as the tension reached its zenith, that Jake decided to indulge in a small, preemptive measure. He subtly tapped the side of his sunglasses, activating the discreetly embedded miniature camera. He'd learned long ago that in disputes, a clear record was invaluable. He also reached down and, with a practiced motion, activated the small GoPro camera attached to Buddy's collar harness. The dog, accustomed to the device from their hikes, barely registered it. The Harris sisters, however, were oblivious to this. They were too consumed by their perceived authority. Fine, Donna spat, turning to the driver. You have your orders. Proceed. The driver, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, sighed and began to lower the hook. The metallic screech, as it made contact with Jake's trailer hitch, felt like a personal affront. Buddy whined, pressing against Jake's leg. Jake knew this was just the beginning. The problem wasn't just a towed vehicle. It was the insidious rot of unchecked power, the casual cruelty of those who believe themselves unaccountable. And as he watched his temporary home being prepped for removal, a cold resolve settled over him. He wasn't just any camper. He was Jake Miller, the new regional HOA board chairman, and Barbara and Donna Harris were about to have a very, very bad day. They just didn't know it yet. The initial conflict had been established. The problem, the abuse of power by the HOA leaders, had been clearly introduced, and the narrative was set for the problem to escalate. The harsh rasp of metal against metal as the tow hook settled onto his trailer hitch sent a fresh wave of frustration through Jake. The tow truck driver, a young man whose face was now a mask of anxious reluctance, avoided Jake's gaze, fiddling with the chains. Buddy pressed hard against Jake's leg, let out a distressed whine, his usual happy-go-lucky demeanor replaced by a protective unease. "Look," Jake said, his voice still measured but with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before, addressing the driver directly but ensuring the Harris sisters heard every word. "You are about to participate in an illegal seizure of private property. I have all the necessary permits. These individuals," he gestured towards Barbara and Donna, "are exceeding their authority. You will be held liable as well." The driver flinched, his knuckles white as he gripped the chain. I just do what I'm told. Mister, I've got a job to keep." "So, you'd break the law to keep your job," Jake pressed, not unkindly, but firmly. Before the driver could answer, Donna stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "He's doing his job, which is more than I can say for some people loitering around here. And you, mister, are testing our patience. We are the HOA. We make the rules here. This isn't a debate. It's not loitering when I'm permitted to be here," Jake corrected. "And your rules cannot supersede state and local laws. You're acting on a whim, on a personal dislike, and calling it official business. That's abuse of power." Barbara let out an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, please, spare us the legal lecture. Are you a lawyer now? On top of being a nature enthusiast who can't respect a simple scenic view, some people just don't belong in refined communities." Her eyes swept over Jake's practical, slightly worn camping attire with disdain. The "some people" jab again. It was clear their issue wasn't just with an SUV and a trailer. It was with him. Jake glanced at the sparkling water of Lake Serenity, then back at the belligerent women. Arguing further was pointless. They were drunk on their minuscule authority, deaf to reason. He'd made his position clear. The cameras were recording. Now it was time for a different approach. He wasn't going to let them see him rattled, nor would he be baited into an unprofessional outburst. "All right," Jake said, a sudden calm descending over him that seemed to unnerve the sisters more than his arguments had. He unclipped Buddy's leash. "Buddy and I were planning on a swim, and we're still going to have it." He looked directly at Barbara and Donna. "You do whatever you feel you must, but rest assured, there will be consequences for your actions. Every action." He turned his back on them, a deliberate act of dismissal, and walked towards the water's edge. Buddy, after a moment's hesitation and a backward glance at the tow truck, bounded happily after him. His barks now excited yips at the prospect of a swim. "Well, I never," he heard Donna exclaim behind him. "The audacity." Barbara's voice followed, laced with derision. "Let him swim. Maybe the cold water will clear his head, or shrink his ego. Get that eyesore out of here." Driver now Jake didn't look back. He waded into the cool, clear water, Buddy paddling joyfully beside him. He swam out a little way, the surface of the lake reflecting the azure sky, the scent of pines still gracing the air. It was a pocket of serenity amidst a storm of human pettiness. From the water, he had a clear view of his campsite. He saw the tow truck driver, now working with a grim determination, chains tightening, the hydraulics of the truck groaning as it began to lift the front of his SUV. He saw Barbara and Donna standing with their arms crossed, overseeing the operation like feudal lords evicting a serf. He watched as his vehicle, his temporary home, his shelter, and virtually all his possessions, his clothes, his food, his camping gear, his primary communication devices, his detailed research notes for the HOA reform project, were inexorably hoisted and then slowly, ponderously, driven away down the access road, disappearing behind the trees. The entire process took less than 10 minutes once they truly committed to it. Jake trod water, Buddy circling him, occasionally nudging his shoulder with a wet nose. A profound sense of violation washed over him, colder than the lake water. It wasn't about the monetary value of what was taken. It was the sheer arrogance, the blatant disregard for his rights, the targeted nature of their hostility. This was precisely the kind of HOA overreach he'd been tasked to investigate and curtail. He was now experiencing it firsthand, a victim of the very system he was supposed to fix. When the rumble of the tow truck faded completely, Jake swam back to shore, Buddy shaking himself vigorously beside him, spraying water everywhere. The spot where his SUV and trailer had stood was now starkly empty. A few flattened patches of grass, some faint tire tracks in the dirt, and Barbara and Donna Harris, still there, a pair of smug sentinels guarding their conquered territory. They watched him approach, their expressions a mixture of triumph and disdain. Donna had a self-satisfied smirk plastered on her face. Barbara's was one of cool, vindictive pleasure. "Enjoy your swim?" Barbara asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Feeling refreshed or perhaps a little lighter?" And she gestured vaguely at the empty space. "You've made a serious mistake," Jake said, his voice quiet, devoid of the anger they clearly expected and craved. Water dripped from his hair and soaked t-shirt. He was acutely aware of his vulnerability. No phone, no wallet readily accessible. It was in the SUV, as were his primary IDs, just the clothes he wore and a very loyal, very wet dog. Donna chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "The only mistake here was you thinking you could just squat on HOA property and disrespect our community standards. We're simply upholding the bylaws, protecting the lake's aesthetic appeal. You should be thanking us." "Thanking you," Jake echoed, a slight lift in his eyebrow. "For theft and harassment." "It's not theft when it's an official impound," Barbara corrected haughtily. "You can retrieve your things from the tow company's yard after paying the towing fee, the storage fees, and, of course, the fine for violating HOA regulations. I believe it will be quite a substantial sum." She seemed to relish the thought. Jake's eyes scanned the shoreline. The elderly fisherman was still there, further down. He'd been an unobtrusive witness to the entire event. Jake was certain the man's phone had been pointed in their direction more often than not. That was good. Corroborating evidence. He took a step closer to the women, who instinctively recoiled slightly, perhaps finally sensing that his calmness was not a sign of defeat. Buddy, sensing his master's shift in demeanor, let out a low, almost inaudible growl, his gaze fixed on the sisters. "I will require your full names again, your official titles within the Lake Serenity HOA, and the specific bylaw number you claim I violated." Jake stated, "It wasn't a request." Donna scoffed, "We already told you, indulge me." Jake interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, looking slightly less confident now that their act of removal was complete and the man they'd wronged was standing before them. Dripping and resolute, they recited their names and titles. Barbara Harris, President, Lake Serenity HOA. Donna Harris, Vice President and head of the Architectural Review Committee, a committee. Jake suspected. That rubber stamped their every whim. Donna vaguely mentioned Bylaw 7 Section C, Subsection 4, Preservation of Scenic Views. Jake made a mental note. He knew, from his preliminary overview of generic HOA bylaws, that such clauses were often intentionally broad and ripe for subjective abuse, and the name and contact information for the towing company, he continued. Barbara waved a dismissive hand. You'll find it on the notice they'll eventually post, or you can look it up. Lakeside Towing and Recovery. They're the only ones contracted by the HOA. For good reason. They're very efficient. Her smile was predatory. Jake nodded slowly. Lakeside Towing. Got it. He looked from Barbara to Donna, his gaze lingering on each of them for a moment. You seem to derive a great deal of satisfaction from this. We derive satisfaction from maintaining the quality and standards of our community, Donna retorted, though some of her earlier bluster had faded, replaced by a more defensive posture. Something people like you wouldn't understand. People like me, Jake repeated softly. He reached into the small, waterproof pouch that was still secured to the waistband of his swim trunks. It was something he always carried when near water, containing a tiny, vacuum-sealed emergency kit, a miniature multi-tool, a waterproof lighter, a small signal mirror, and, crucially, a water-resistant pen and a folded, waterproofed piece of paper. The sisters watched, their eyes narrowed, probably expecting him to pull out a fishing license or some other irrelevant document they could dismiss. Instead, Jake calmly clicked the pen and began to write on the small, stiff paper, bracing it against his thigh. Their names, their stated titles, the alleged bylaw, the towing company, the date and time. His movements were methodical, precise. The act of writing, of documenting, seemed to unsettle them more than any shouted threat could have. It was an act of deliberate record-keeping, a prelude to a process they clearly hadn't anticipated extending beyond their initial petty victory. The tide, Jake knew, was already beginning to turn. Even if only he could feel the shift in the current. Their laughter and jeers had faded, replaced by an uneasy silence as he wrote. The escalation was complete. They had taken everything. His quiet, systematic response was the subtle, initial twist, hinting that the victim was not as helpless or as ignorant as they had presumed. The stage was being set for a more dramatic revelation. The sight of Jake meticulously documenting their encounter seemed to puncture the Harris sisters' triumphant bubble. Their smug expressions faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. They had anticipated outrage, perhaps pleading or even futile threats. This calm, methodical note-taking was an unexpected response, and it was unnerving. What do you think you're doing? Donna finally asked, her voice a little shriller than before. You think writing things down changes anything? Your stuff is gone. You're trespassing now. Technically, the campsite permit was for you and your vehicle. Jake ignored her, carefully folding the waterproof paper and tucking it back into his pouch. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the now empty campsite, lingering for a moment on the faint indentations where his trailer had rested. He then turned his attention back to the sisters, his expression unreadable. You know, Jake said, his voice thoughtful. I've spent a good part of my life serving this country, defending the rights of its citizens, rights that include due process, freedom from arbitrary seizure of property, and the right to be treated with basic human dignity, regardless of how one chooses to lawfully enjoy a public space. Barbara snorted, attempting to regain her earlier bravado. Oh, here we go. The sob story, save it. We're not impressed by your supposed service. Around here, what matters is respecting community standards and HOA authority. Authority, Jake repeated, a wry smile touching his lips. Let's talk about authority. You believe your positions as president and vice president of the Lake Serenity HOA grant you absolute power within this little fiefdom you've carved out. It grants us the power to enforce the bylaws that everyone agreed to when they bought property here, Donna stated, puffing her chest out slightly. Bylaws you, as a transient, clearly have no respect for. I respect laws, Jake corrected. Legitimate, fairly applied laws, not the capricious whims of two individuals who seem to believe aesthetic appeal is a justifiable reason to harass and dispossess someone. Tell me, Do you have documented, objective criteria for what constitutes an aesthetic infraction? Is there a checklist, a color chart, perhaps? Or is it just whatever Barbara and Donna Harris decide they don't like on any given day? His pointed questions, delivered with a lawyerly precision, seemed to hit a nerve. The sisters exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. Our criteria are well established and understood by the community. Barbara insisted, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Are they Jake pressed? Because I'd be very interested to see the minutes from the HOA meeting where these specific criteria for vehicle aesthetics at permitted recreational sites were discussed and approved, or the official warnings issued to other violators prior to immediate impoundment. Transparency is key to legitimate authority. Wouldn't you agree? The elderly fisherman, who had subtly edged closer along the shoreline, paused in the act of reeling in his line. He was now unmistakably observing them, his earlier pretense of disinterest gone. Jake gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod. An ally, however passive, was always welcome. It was then that Jake decided it was time to shift the dynamic more overtly. The initial shock of the seizure was over. His quiet resistance and documentation had planted seeds of doubt in his antagonist's minds. Now it was time for the revelation. He reached down to Buddy, who was sitting patiently by his side, occasionally nudging his hand for reassurance. Good boy, Buddy, Jake murmured, scratching him behind the ears. He then looked directly at Barbara and Donna. You made a comment earlier about not knowing who I am, Jake said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. And you're right, you don't. You assumed I was just some random camper, an easy target for your little power trip. He took a slow, deliberate step toward them. They held their ground, but there was a new wariness in their eyes. You spoke of HOA authority. Jake continued. You wielded it like a cudgel, but authority, ladies, is a layered thing. There are local HOAs, like yours, and then there are higher levels of oversight. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. He saw comprehension dawning, slowly and painfully. On Donna's face first, Barbara was a beat behind, her expression shifting from arrogance to confusion, then to a dawning unease. My name is Jake Miller. He let that sink in for a moment. It wouldn't mean anything to them yet, but the next part would. And as of 3 days ago, I was appointed the new regional HOA board chairman for the Tri-County area. My mandate, he added, his voice hardening, is to oversee, investigate, and where necessary, reform the operational conduct of all constituent HOAs, including, as it happens, the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association. The silence that followed was profound. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the lake water, the distant cry of a bird, and Buddy's soft panting. Barbara's jaw, which had been set in a line of smug defiance, slowly went slack. Donna's eyes widened, and a faint flush began to creep up her neck. The color drained from their faces, leaving them looking sallow and suddenly much older. You're joking, Barbara managed to stammer, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her disbelief. That's not possible. We would have been notified. My appointment was kept internal for the initial observation phase, Jake explained calmly, to allow for an unbiased assessment of current HOA operations without the performative adjustments that often accompany the knowledge of being scrutinized. You, ladies, have just provided me with an extraordinarily vivid and personal example of precisely the kind of misconduct I'm here to address. Donna looked like she was about to be physically ill. But your vehicle, the permits, were all perfectly in order. As I told you, Jake said, which you would have known if you'd bothered with due diligence instead of leaping to a prejudiced judgment. You didn't just inconvenience a camper. You unlawfully seized the property of the man who holds the authority to investigate your entire operation and, if necessary, suspend it. He then delivered the twist he'd been holding on to. And speaking of evidence, Jake said, reaching down to Buddy's collar, you were so focused on your perceived authority, so quick to dismiss me, that you failed to notice a few things. He deftly unclipped the small, robust GoPro camera from Buddy's harness. It was still recording, its tiny blue light blinking steadily. My dog, Buddy. Where's this on our outings? He's quite the little documentarian. Jake held up the camera. It's been recording since before your tow truck even arrived. It captured your delightful commentary, your refusal to examine my permits, your orders to the tow truck driver, everything, if it were possible. The Harris sisters paled even further. They stared at the small camera as if it were a venomous snake. But that's not all. Jake continued, his voice relentless, but still maddeningly calm. He tapped the side of his now slightly askew sunglasses. These also have a recording function. High definition. Excellent audio. I activated them when your tow truck first pulled up. He took them off, showing the tiny, almost invisible lens embedded in the frame. So, we have multiple angles of this entire interaction. He paused, then added the final, crushing blow. And just before you so efficiently had my vehicle and all my belongings removed, including my primary phone, I managed to send a short, encrypted message with my exact GPS coordinates in a preset alert code to my chief of staff. Given that I'm now effectively incommunicado, I imagine a regional alert is already in motion. They'll be wondering why the new regional chairman has suddenly gone silent after reporting an issue at Lake Serenity. Barbara swayed slightly, and Donna put a hand out to steady herself against a nearby tree, her eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route that didn't exist. But the real icing on the cake, Jake said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, though it carried clearly in the stillness, was your decision to rifle through my personal belongings. You see, when the tow truck driver was occupied with the chains on one side, and you two were congratulating yourselves on the other. One of you, I believe it was Donna, but the footage will confirm, decided to try the door of my SUV, finding it unlocked, as I sometimes leave it insecure. Permitted areas like this. You then opened it, and then you reached inside. Donna gasped, a choked, strangled sound. No. I just looked, but the GoPro on Buddy has a wider angle than you might think, and it was positioned perfectly to see into the vehicle when the door was open. Jake said, it recorded you, Donna, reaching in and picking up my field glasses from the passenger seat, and then, Barbara, you joined her, and you picked up a stack of papers from the console, my research and notes. As it happens, you even commented on my messy handwriting. He saw the raw panic in their eyes now. This wasn't just about abuse of HOA power anymore. This was potentially entering the realm of tampering with personal property, perhaps even theft. Depending on what the full footage showed, their official impound narrative was crumbling. You didn't just tow a vehicle under questionable pretenses, Jake stated, his voice now carrying the full weight of his impending authority. You trespassed upon my personal effects, and it's all on camera. The silence from the sisters was absolute. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly inverted. The hunters had become the hunted, caught red-handed by the very man they had sought to victimize. The fisherman, Jake noticed, had stopped pretending to fish altogether and was now openly watching. His expression one of rapt attention. The hidden truth of Jake's identity and the existence of the video recordings had been revealed, marking a significant shift in power. The air, thick with the Harris sisters' shattered arrogance, vibrated with Jake's pronouncement. Barbara stared, her face a mask of disbelief, the carefully constructed edifice of her authority crumbling into dust. Donna trembled, her gaze darting between Jake's implacable expression and the incriminating GoPro still clutched in his hand. Therefore, Jake's voice cut through the stunned silence, each word a hammer blow, effective immediately. By the power vested in me as Regional HOA Board Chairman, I am provisionally suspending both of you, Barbara Harris and Donna Harris, from any and all duties, responsibilities, and access related to the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association. A full audit and investigation will commence within 24 hours. An interim counsel, appointed by my office, will assume control until further notice. Suspended, Barbara finally choked out, the word ragged, laced with a dawning terror. You You can't. This is an outrage. We'll fight this. You are free to pursue any legal recourse you deem appropriate, Jake replied, his tone glacial. But the evidence of gross misconduct, abuse of authority, and potential criminal behavior is, as you now know, substantial and irrefutable. Your fight, Miss Harris, will be an uphill one. As if summoned by the gravity of the moment, the wail of sirens sliced through the lakeside tranquility, growing rapidly closer. Not a random patrol this time, Jake had, during his meticulous note-taking earlier, discreetly activated a location-based distress signal linked directly to the regional security dispatch, a contingency for field operatives facing immediate threat, a relic from a past life that still proved useful. Barbara and Donna exchanged horrified glances. The arrival of law enforcement, not as their enforcers, but as impartial arbiters potentially investigating them, was a nightmare scenario they had never contemplated. Two sheriff's deputies emerged from their vehicle, their expressions hardening as they took in the scene. Jake, still damp but radiating an unassailable composure. The two women, visibly shaking, their faces ashen, and the glaring emptiness of the campsite. Problem here, folks, the senior deputy asked, his eyes assessing Jake. Jake Miller, regional HOA chairman, Jake stated, his voice carrying clearly. These individuals, Barbara and Donna Harris, president and vice president of the local HOA, have just illegally impounded my vehicle and personal property. Furthermore, he held up the GoPro. I have video evidence of them unlawfully entering my vehicle and tampering with my belongings. Their actions and their justifications are fully documented. The fisherman, emboldened, stepped forward. Did I cipher? Officer, I saw the whole thing, got a fair bit of it on my phone too. If it helps, they treated this man disgracefully. The deputy's professional demeanor sharpened. One began to question the Harris sisters, whose attempts at coherent explanation quickly devolved into a blubbering mess of half-denials and frantic accusations of a setup. The other took Jake's preliminary statement, his pen flying across his notepad as Jake calmly detailed the events, his recitation of facts precise and damning. The GoPro footage was briefly reviewed on a small, rugged tablet one of the deputies produced, eliciting grim nods. The carefully constructed world of Barbara and Donna Harris imploded, stripped of their petty power, exposed as bullies and lawbreakers. They were escorted, trembling and tear-streaked, to the patrol car for further questioning at the station. The charge, for now, was pending investigation into illegal towing, unlawful entry, and potential theft. Their reign of terror over Lake Serenity had ended not with a bang, but with the whimpering collapse of their own making, within hours. Jake's SUV and trailer were recovered from the impound lot, the owner of Lakeside Towing and Recovery profusely apologizing, claiming he'd been grossly misled by the Harris sisters, a claim Jake's office would scrutinize intensely. 1 week later, the Lake Serenity Community Hall buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in years. It was standing room only. Jake Miller, no longer the anonymous camper, but the publicly acknowledged regional HOA board chairman, stood at the podium. Buddy lay at his feet, a furry golden emblem of the catalyst for this watershed moment. Today, Jake began, his voice resonating with quiet power, marks a new beginning. He didn't rehash the sordid details of his encounter. The widely circulated videos and news reports had already done that. Instead, he spoke of the future. For too long, the concept of a homeowners association in too many communities has been twisted. What was intended as a mechanism for collective betterment became, in some hands, an instrument of oppression, vague rules, selectively enforced. Power wielded not for the community, but for personal gratification. Transparency replaced by secrecy, fairness by favoritism. He looked out at the faces before him, hopeful, wary, but undeniably engaged. That era ends now. My office is implementing immediate, sweeping reforms across this entire Tri-County region. Ironclad transparency in all HOA governance and financial dealings, clearly defined. Objective, and legally vetted bylaws. No more room for subjective, aesthetic tyranny. Independent review boards for all disputes, mandatory ethics and legal training for all elected HOA officials, and a dedicated regional ombudsman to champion the rights of homeowners. He paused, letting his words sink in. The Lake Serenity HOA will be the model for this change. We will rebuild it, together, from the ground up, into an association that truly serves you, all of you, with integrity, respect, and a commitment to justice. Not just for property values, but for human values. A hesitant ripple of applause began, then swelled into a thunderous, sustained ovation. People rose to their feet, a tangible wave of relief and hope washing through the hall. It was the sound of a community awakening, of shackles being broken. Jake Miller watched them, a profound sense of purpose settling within him. The Battle of Lake Serenity had been a brutal, unexpected skirmish, but it had ignited a revolution. The road ahead would be arduous, fraught with entrenched interest and resistance to change. But as he looked at the determined faces of the people he was now sworn to serve, with Buddy's warm presence a comforting anchor beside him, Jake knew this was a fight worth waging. The hero had not just risen, he had brought an army of empowered citizens with him. The fall of two petty tyrants was merely the first stone turned in the foundation of a new, more equitable future.